This discussion is about childbirth. Around 40 years ago, it wasn't always culturally acceptable for men to be present during labour, but today it seems normal practice for the partner to be with the mother throughout all the stages of labour. But is this always a good idea? Some men might not want to be there, some may insist, but are couples feeling pressured into conforming to a modern, politically correct and Western idea that a man must be present during childbirth? I'm joined by Dr. Michel Odent, former obstetrician and founder of the Primal Health Research Centre in London. He introduced in the 1970s the concepts of home-like birthing rooms and birthing pools in maternity hospitals. Professor Tina Miller, who's a professor of sociology at Oxford Brookes University and author of Maternal Spheres, What Are We Doing With Me? Michael Preston, father of 4-year-old Finn, who was present at his son's birth and feels strongly that men should be. And on the phone, Millie Hill, a writer and columnist and founder of the Positive Birth Movement. I'd like to come to you first, Dr. Michel Odent. Is there a perfect solution? And has it taken too long to even approach the subject about men being at the birth of their child?
I don't want to say men should be or should not be at birth. I'm a student. I try to understand. I've been a student for a long time, since I was already involved in childbirth 60 years ago in a Paris hospital. I'm still involved in childbirth. I had the experience, I've been in charge of about 15,000 births in hospitals before, during the turning point of the new doctrine, and after. I've also the experience of home birth. First, going to a home birth by myself at a certain phase of the history. Baby's father always participating in the birth, the modern way. More recently, when I participate in a home birth, I go there with a very highly experienced doula. In general, my attitude is to stay in the kitchen and to make the husband busy. So, starting from what I have learned, I can say, to summarize, even it's not diplomatic, if not it's not politically correct, but I think we have to say that at a time when births are more and more difficult. I can say that I'm more and more convinced, and particularly talking with the doulas now, more and more convinced that one of the most common reasons for long and difficult birth today is the participation of the baby's father, particularly when they have been prepared. We have been pioneered to introduce man in a birthing room. We are pioneers. Many people came to our hospital for that reason, pioneered to prepare the husband. So this is a kind of conclusion, having been involved in childbirth through different phases of the history for 60 years.
60 years. Well, we'll come back to you to discuss the turning point.
People were involved in childbirth 60 years ago and still now.
I'll ask the man in the room here, Michael Preston, and father of 4-year-old Finn, your response to that.
Well, I'm not an academic, and I can only talk from my personal experience. For me personally, me and my partner are likely to only have one child in our lives. So this was for me personally, it was likely to be a once in a lifetime experience to actually go through the experience of being with someone while they're giving birth. For me personally, me and my partner decided very early on, and we talked about it, and she wanted it very important that she was supported through the birth by friends, so that she didn't actually have to deal with doctors and all that kind of stuff. She could just concentrate on relaxing and being involved in the birth. And so there were two people present at the birth, me and a very close friend of ours, and we were both there to support her so that one of us could be supporting her and one of us could run off and talk to the doctors. And we swapped. Sometimes it was my friend, sometimes it was me, but I was very clear in my own head about the fact that this was my child, and I wanted to support my partner in whatever way she wanted to be supported. Because from my perspective, fundamentally, I think it is important that fundamentally the focus has got to be on the woman because she's doing it. So to that degree, anybody else other than that woman is kind of superfluous to the plot. Having said that, it's my child, and I want to support my partner, and I want to be there, and I want to be involved. And I think having had the conversation early on with my partner, so that very much she was the driving force in terms of setting the boundaries of what she wanted and how she wanted me to be there. I'm absolutely fine with that, because I figure that's my role in my relationship is to support my partner, as is hers to support me. I mean, it's a two-way thing. I don't see there's certain bits of her life that I shouldn't be involved in, I shouldn't support her on.
So this is a reflection of how couples are living in modern Britain or across the many parts of the Western world. Professor Tina Miller, you were nodding in agreement there.
Well, I think that we've been pioneers in lots of different areas recently, so not just childbirth, but we've seen enormous changes in gendered relationships and the ways in which we organise and carry out family life. So one of our expectations now in the UK, certainly, and in many Western countries, is that men have a choice or are present at the birth. How we support them, though, is a different question, and what they do there is also a different question. So I think that we currently lead them in to expect that in some ways they can almost orchestrate aspects of the birth through the birth plan. And this came out in research that I carried out. I've been following a group of men through 5 years now of becoming a father for the first time. And this was very clear that although they wanted to be there, and they were grateful or happy that they were there, it was a very, at times, alienating, confusing, traumatising even experience for some of them. But the couple themselves felt that it was the thing that they did want to share. So I think that men should have the choice to be there. I certainly wouldn't feel that they shouldn't be there. But I do think that it raises new questions for how we provide services in that sphere, particularly to men and particularly postnatally to men as well.
Millie Hill then, founder of the Positive Birth Movement. Is there a perfect solution?
I'm not sure that there is at the moment. I'm certainly listening to the comments that have been made and reflecting on Michel Odent's point about removing men from the birth room and that making birth easier for women. I understand his point that women need to produce oxytocin and they need to not feel that they're being observed and they don't need somebody anxious in the room who brings adrenaline into the space. But my feeling is that the idea of removing dads is just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to oxytocin levels. During birth. At the moment, we've got people giving birth in very sort of unfamiliar environments in hospital where they don't really know any of the faces. They haven't got one-to-one care from midwives they've met before. It's quite brightly lit. It's not a very homely place to be. And so the idea of removing dads from a woman in that situation seems the wrong approach to me.
Is there the question, though, it's not just necessarily the removal of the father or the male and not compensating that with someone else? Is there then the best practice or a suggested practice is that role be a woman? Michel?
I want to make some comments about what we heard and the terms, the vocabulary which is used today, the terms that came back very often. You have used about a dozen of times the word support. You spoke about choice, plan. These, in a dominant paradigm, these are key words. We say women need support. It means a woman is not able to give birth. She needs some energy brought by somebody else. Well, when you think like physiologists, and the involuntary process need much more to be protected. The key word is protection of an involuntary process against inhibitory factors. Support is a way to reinforce our deep-rooted cultural conditioning. A woman is not able to give birth. She needs an expert, a coach. She needs support, energy brought by somebody else. It's a dominant paradigm. And you are using the word plan, choice, and so on. Choice is intellectual. Plan is something intellectual. It has to do with verbal language. But when a woman is giving birth, what is important is not the verbal language, it's the non-verbal language, it's the body language. Illustrate that with just an anecdote among hundreds. A woman in hard labor at home, she has always said, I cannot imagine giving birth without my husband, like all modern women. Labor was going on slowly. And suddenly the man said, oh, the shop will close at 1 o'clock. I have to buy a bottle of milk. He went to buy a bottle of milk. As soon as he has gone, the woman started to scream. kill me. She went to the loo, to the toilet. When the guy came back with his bottle of milk, baby was born. This woman, with non-verbal language, has said exactly the opposite of what you say when you make a choice. A choice is intellectual. During the birth process, the important language is non-verbal.
Millie, you wanted to interrupt then.
Yes, I think I was just going to make the point as well that not all dads are the same, and so one man might feel very uncomfortable and might make the birth environment, and perhaps this man who went to get his milk is a good case in point. Perhaps he was feeling very uncomfortable and anxious and making her feel unable to give birth, but other men may be excellent birth supporters and may be absolutely brilliant at, relaxing the woman and making her feel safe and being a real guardian of the birth space for her.
It's better when the man is not brilliant, but much more low profile.
All I was going to say is whilst I take on board the kind of medical side of the thing, there is a side of me that thinks on some level, well, personally I wouldn't have ever thought of popping out for a pint of milk, because I think that's kind of running for cover if there ever is an example of it. And I kind of knew to some degree, birth on some levels, whilst it's not traumatic, it can be a traumatic process. And emotionally, my partner didn't know what to expect, having never had a child before, and that's part of the reason she wanted me there, because it was she knew it would be an emotionally challenging experience, because she's going to be in pain, and and on some levels it's pain that we wanted to happen because we want a child, but then at the same time, I can't envisage a situation where my partner would have been in a similar situation in terms of levels of emotional heightenment and so on and so forth, where had I got the option to support her in whatever way she wanted me to support her, I wouldn't
support.
Well, I wouldn't have gone in. Well, but then having said that, the point you made about saying support in effect means the woman can't do it on her own, I don't think that's true. And that's not the reason I was there. My partner was totally able to give birth without me being there. But that's not really, I wasn't there to help her give birth. I was there so that she had someone to cuddle her when the contractions were coming really strong, and it was painful, and she was feeling that. And
a man can be protective, but the keyword protection is not fashionable.
Well, it's not even protection.
You're also there to meet your child.
Well, absolutely, yeah. And the midwife said to me, "Do you want to cut the cord?" And I was like, "No way, do I want to cut the cord."
Reinforcing the cultural conditioning that somebody must be there to cut the cord.
Part of the reason I didn't want to do it is because I was terrified that my cock end up.
That's cultural conditioning. A woman cannot give birth by herself. Somebody must be there to cut the cord.
That whole idea, I agree, and I think you've done some excellent and brilliant work in terms of trying to sort of demedicalise birth.
Yes, demedicalise is negative.
Well,
I prefer to understand what makes a birth easy.
I think as a sociologist, I'm interested, and I've looked at birth in Bangladesh. I've lived there and in the Solomon Islands as well. So I'm very interested in terms of how we sort of how we've cluttered birth up with moving it into hospitals dominated by male obstetricians, the 1950s, whilst also accepting that a lot of working class women in the UK were happy with a hospital and a birth. It was a rest, it was cleaner than home, it was all sorts of things. So we have to take into account the historical context as well. But of course, culture becomes overlaid with sort of social and different practices. And if I teach young students now, all of them think the normal place, to give birth is the hospital, which is very sad.
Of 98% birth.
98%, absolutely, that's right. So for me, it's about trying to make that place somewhere that women can feel as relaxed as possible. Now, that might be with doulas. It might not be having any technology in the room. It will be all, sort of birthing centres, etc. I absolutely agree with. And if the couple want the husband to be there, and if he might want to do sort of skin-to-skin contact once the baby's born. And I think for men, as we have encouraged them much more into being more involved fathers, and I know this is all more jargon terminology, but to participate in the child's life. I think for men it's that point of birth and meeting their child for the first time that is really significant.
That's what we have learned from 40 years now.
Yeah. That's great. I mean, but I think that's...
Yes, but what I noticed in the 70s, because we have been pioneers I use the term participation of the father, pioneer, that from that phase of the history had a terrible lack of sleep. About the place of birth, I think it's a secondary issue. Right. The dominant issue is a cultural lack of understanding of the birth process. We don't understand that it's an involuntary process, and the key word in terms of need is protection. And today, it's incredibly common to disturb home birth dramatically, just by talking.
Yeah, I mean, you have to fight to have home birth.
Because I know many doulas have anecdotes, of midwife who are having a birth, they start asking questions. Exactly the recipe to make a birth long and difficult. Adding a certain number of people. In general, more than one person around a laboring woman, it's a lot. I'd like to mention briefly a scenario I'm quite familiar with, but it's almost unknown in our society and culturally unacceptable. But all the components of these scenarios can be interpreted in the light of modern physiology. It's simple. A laboring woman with nobody around, apart from one experienced and silent midwife or doula, sitting in a corner, low profile, and knitting. That's all. People cannot imagine how easy a birth can be in this situation. At a time where births are more difficult, it should be politically correct to talk about situations that make a birth easy. It's culturally unacceptable. And what about the father? And if the man is a midwife is a man, and knitting, promoting it, that's sexist, and so it's utopian. But the interesting aspect in this scenario that I know quite well, staying in the kitchen with the father, is introducing the baby's father in a birthing place after the birth of the baby and the placenta. At that time, the reaction of the man always is, I'm so proud of you. Admiration for his wife, respect for his wife, something mysterious, increased love for his wife. And we understand that after that, the attachment of the father for the baby will not be a direct bonding. It cannot be the same that between mother and baby. They are not in the same hormonal balance. But after that, it will be gradual attachment to the baby via a reinforced attachment, love, respect, admiration for his wife. Thinking of the time when they were goddesses.
But go on.
I was going to say. I mean, I absolutely understand what Michel is saying here, and I'm not. I can only talk from my personal experience. I'm not an academic. I haven't got a wad of empirical evidence that I can pull out and say, okay, here's the evidence. What I can say is my admiration, my love for my partner. It's not decreased. It's not increased to some degree. I mean, I read the Observer article that I was picked up from. Michel mentioned a thing that some fathers can have a diminished level of attraction and so on and so forth to their partner because it's the process. And I honestly, for me personally, it hasn't had any impact at all. The idea of waiting in the kitchen until the placenta has been delivered. Personally, that's just not at all what I would have wanted. Now, having said that, had my partner said, I don't want you anywhere near me, I would have been really upset about it, but I would have respected her wishes, because fundamentally it's got to be about her, because she's the person who's doing the work.
If I say we must reduce the rate of C-section, that will be culturally acceptable, diplomatically correct. But if I describe such a situation, only obstacles. Obstacle is not politically correct. That's the paradox of our time.
So do you think that birthing has become politically correct?
When you know how a birth can be easy, it's frustrating to see how we make it difficult. In this discussion, what I might say, and that's a difficulty, it's as if you are a tree. You talk, and I am the forest. I'm thinking of 15,000 births in many environments, you talk about your own story. And that's the difficulty in the conversation.
Well, also as a woman
the tree and the forest.
Millie, you go on, Tina, and then Millie.
I've had 3 children, and I mean the idea of just being alone in a room. I've been so socialised into birth needing preparation antenatally, even though actually I was living in Bangladesh at that time, and of course it wasn't part of how you prepared in Bangladesh. But, you know, we're so deeply socialised, I agree with you.
For thousands of years.
Absolutely. And so how on earth do we start to unpick those thousands of years?
Mm-hmm. That's almost what you're saying, isn't it? It's not very politically correct, but there's an argument for going back to how it really was very basic, with a woman being given the acknowledgement that she could do it by herself, and it wasn't necessary that men needed to be involved. Millie?
Well, I just wanted to pipe up because I actually just had a birth quite recently myself as a woman, and it was in many ways like Michel is describing. I had a home birth with a knitting midwife. Literally, she did knit a hat during the birth. However, my partner was also there, and it was a water birth, and the labour went on all night, so we spent quite a lot of time, just him and me, in a birth pool. My partner was with me and supporting me, but that doesn't make me feel like I didn't give birth myself. I still feel that I am the person that did it and did that amazing thing, and I feel proud of myself, and my partner was proud of me, and his presence did not detract from that feeling of having done it myself, nor did it detract from my ability to give birth quite easily.
I'm interested also in the science, and is there enough studies, is there enough evidence for saying that the adrenaline that men produce restricts the oxytocin that women have in order to give birth quickly, and that maybe the compromise is to have another woman alongside you, like you did yourself, Millie?
I think there are a lot of things that are happening in modern birth that are inhibiting the release of oxytocin. And yes, having an anxious, fiddly man with you might be one of those things, but we've got brightly lit maternity units and interruptions and constant vaginal exams and, lots of strangers, etc., in the birth room. That's also making it difficult for women to give birth very easily.
I mean, interestingly, the other birth partner when my child was born was a woman who happened to be a doula as well. So it might be that my situation is different insofar as the fact that our friend Alice Amanda was there and maybe balanced off any adrenaline that I was bringing in. Although I think it's really important for men to be involved, and I think that part of the reason some fathers have a kind of hands-off attitude to a whole bunch of stuff is because they don't get involved in some of the really important things that happen like this, and that's kind of why I felt it was really important to be there. I want to be involved in my child growing up.
What we must emphasize, it might be a point of departure, is to realize that today, where childbirth is concerned, we are at the bottom of the abyss. Today, if you consider that most women replace their natural oxytocin with a drip of synthetic oxytocin, that many women give birth by cesarean section, we can observe, it's an observation, we were talking about studies, but it's an observation at the planetary level, that today the number of women who give birth to the baby and to the placenta, thanks to the release of what is in reality a cocktail of love hormones. We know that the mixture of hormones released to give birth by the body, it's a cocktail of love hormones. We can say today, at the planetary level, this number is becoming insignificant. It's an observation. Even in developing countries, women give birth with a drip of synthetic oxytocin, and often C-section and so on. And it means that today, at a global level, at the level of humanity, we have made love hormones useless in a critical period surrounding birth, critical period for the formation of individuals. We have to start from that. That's why we have to dare to shake the limits of political correctness. If we go on being politically correct, if we stay in the same paradigm, with the same vocabulary, we'll remain at the bottom of the abyss. That's why the vocabulary is so important. There is no paradigm shift without vocabulary language shift.
Millie Hill, that sounds similar to your positive birth movement. Am I right in drawing similarities there?
Well, yes, I think we are trying with the positive birth movement to address the negativity and epidemic of fear around childbirth. But also, I love what Michel is saying about language. One of the things that we talk about a lot within the positive birth movement groups is the language of permission that is constantly used around childbirth. I heard it used only yesterday. A woman said to me, a consultant had said to her he was very surprised that she had been allowed to have a home birth because she was a certain blood group. We talk constantly about whether women are allowed to do something or not allowed to do something. Women will say they let me do this or they let me do that when they're telling their birth stories. And this language of permission really needs to be challenged because women are allowed to do whatever they like when they have their babies. But a lot of mums and dads who are preparing for childbirth aren't addressing this issue. They're not aware of the fact that they are completely in control and in charge of their birth experience, and that the choices that they make are entirely up to them. And how they give birth and how they bring their baby into the world is their choice, and they have human rights in this area. So certainly there's so much language used around childbirth that needs to be challenged. And my number one on my list would be what I call the language of permission, where people are talking in terms of what they are allowed or not allowed to do when they're having a baby.
Professor Miller.
I mean, I agree in many ways. I think women, if we look at how women are prepared, and again, I'm sure the language is not going to be liked, but that's, the reality of sort of antenatal preparation. It always amazes me that we, but women are, have been socialised now for so long that there's an expectation that we no longer know our bodies in a way that we did, and that we do need experts to guide us through this process. And when we get to the hospital, we hand over any freedoms that we might feel we have, because we just want a safe birth, and the discourse of risk which surrounds it and all of these things, are very, very unhelpful. So I absolutely agree with you. I mean, the idea of women regaining and feeling a greater sense of control would be wonderful. I'm sure would lead to less C-sections, etc. And the idea of drips being used just as normal process, I think, is also absolutely alarming. I still feel that there should be choices in couples. Men should be there as well if they want to be, but if they don't want to be, and if they don't want to undertake tasks like cutting the cord, and I know many men feel encouraged to do that, and there's no reason why they should, then, I think we need to think about that too. But this really needs unpacking from the moment of conception.
Well, I mean,
Michael.
I was nodding partly because I agree with a lot of what was just said. I mean, I didn't really, and when I was offered the chance to cut the cord, I really didn't understand the symbolism really there. And I think, it's a medical thing that needs to be done, and I'd much rather a trained professional did it than me. But the interesting thing I thought, in terms of what Millie just said about choices, I'd hate to say, I'd like to have a situation present where what Millie said was the truth all the time. But in my particular case of me and my partner, she did opt for choices that weren't given to her. I mean, we really, really wanted a water birth. Because my partner had gestational diabetes, and we were told the risk was too high. And personally, I still question whether or not the risk was high. And I'm not a doctor. I can't tell you now, absolutely the risk was only that much and not that much. But what I can say is, and I think this is part of what feeds into why there's so many caesareans, is that there's a lot of doctors who are terrified of being sued because something goes wrong. And so you slice open a woman and whip the baby out, and it's fairly simple because you cut, stitch up, job done, no particular problems. The minute you start actually empowering women to have choice over what they do, of course the medical professionals in the situation are to some degree superfluous, because the woman is controlling what's going on, and a lot of medical people find that terrifying, and I think it's a terrible comment on the world that people like my partner are stopped from having. I mean, the birth was good, but it was a little bit bittersweet because we really, really had wanted to have a water birth, and we were told in no uncertain terms you can't have one.
I think I'm going to have the final word from you, Dr. Odent.
I just want to repeat a little bit what we have said, because it's important. At the time we hope to enter a new paradigm, to reconsider the effect of thousands of years of cultural conditioning. For that we need the help of modern physiology. But about language, in this context, at a time when it's so important to have a paradigm shift, we must realize that where childbirth is concerned, the important language is the non-verbal language. To a certain extent, to make choices beginning of the pregnancy is dangerous. In our society, we are constantly condemned to make choices. It's intellectual operation. And that's not appropriate when you talk about childbirth. We don't take enough into account the non-verbal language, the body language. That's the important one.
That was Dr. Michel Odent, who was joined by Professor Tina Miller, writer Millie Hill, and father of 4-year-old Finn, Michael Preston.